Hi everyone, Vicky here and welcome to Foods That Heal interview series where we explore the power of food and show you how to eat in order to live a healthier and longer life. And today the subject is a fun subject because we're talking about how the way we eat interfere in our health and have an impact on our health. So to do that, to have that conversation, I have invited the one of a kind chef, Dr. Mike. Hi, Dr. Mike.
Hey, Vicky, thanks for having me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here. So Michael S. Fenster is known as Chef Dr. Mike, and he is also a food shaman. And he is one of a kind because he is a board certified cardiologist, interventional cardiologist, and also a professional chef. So in addition to his clinical practice, he hosts a weekly show available on iTunes, and it's called Journeys into Quantum Food. He has appeared as an expert guest on many national radio and TV programs such as The Doctor and Fox National News. He will serve as well this year. He will serve as the food and health expert on the television series called Reversed. And Chef Dr. Mike has write regular column for Psychology Today, and he has authored many books. And the latest book, it's called Food Shaman: The Art of Quantum Food, and the book is Amazon #1 new release and the top 10 bestsellers. So congratulations.
Thanks, Vicky, and I'm excited since the book really just came out, less than a month ago. So we're getting great feedback on that, and I'm excited to share some of the things and give some teasers as to what's in the book.
Yes. So I guess the first question I have for you is, what is a food shaman?
That's a great question because, as you said, I'm pretty unique, and I was pretty unique before I was a chef and before I was a cardiologist. Definitely one of a kind,
Yeah.
as it were. And a shaman historically was a one of a kind individual for their particular community. And what's really fascinating is if we look in the history, all of us at some point in terms of our forebears worked with shamans because we're all the daughters and sons of some sort of tribe. And all of us as human beings participated in the tribe in which there was an individual who was a seeker between the worlds. And that was the shaman. And as a food shaman, I cross into this betwixt and between. I have one foot understanding food as medicine as an interventional cardiologist, certainly. Many, if not most, or all of our health endpoints look at cardiovascular endpoints as well as, cancer endpoints. But people want to know, hey, if I eat this, is it going to give me a heart attack? Am I going to have a stroke? Am I going to die? And on the other hand, as a professional chef, I have a foot in the world of food as cuisine. And I understand this betwixt and between prescription and pleasure. And we shouldn't discount the whole food experience in terms of its impact on individuals and with health. And I know we're going to talk about that as the interview goes on. But, very briefly, being a food shaman as I am, it involves a process of, bringing and exposing people to the beauty, the harmony, the power of the food experience beyond what we're told in terms of RDAs and nutritions and eat this and don't eat that and all these regulations and guidelines. We take in food. It's very important to understand the quality of the food we eat, how we eat, with whom we eat. All these we're learning have tremendous impacts in terms of our health and in terms of understanding our relationship with ourselves, with others, and really with the universe as a whole in the confines and the constructs of our relationship with food. I like to say the history of food is the history of humanity. And so when we explore that, we explore ourselves.
Right. And is a food shaman, is it a term that you created, or it's really something that it's a thing?
As you mentioned, I am the one and only. So it's something I came up with to describe kind of my unique approach, because I could tell you in working, in mass media, being on television, things like that, it's a challenge because people want to label you as a health professional, which means looking at food in terms of RDAs and looking at results from
Mm,
test tubes and what's your lipid profile. Or people want to say, hey, I want something delicious for the spring and summertime. Cook me, a recipe. How do I do a barbecue? And the truth of our food experience, the power of our food experience lies in drawing from both of these.
mm,
But as the food shaman, I want to bring that information to folks, and certainly they can utilize for themselves the tools of the shaman, which is understanding this interconnectedness of all things, along with the power of science, to
yes.
integrate and evolve our perspective. Because I think we really, really have to have a new way of looking at food and health, because of the complexity and the changes to our food and food pathways.
Okay. And I'm a foodie myself. I love to eat, and I love
I knew that's why I loved you right away.
yeah. And I love to explore food and new food and the experience. So what is the connection between the experience and health?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer that in two parts.
Okay.
So we can look at how food impacts our health directly. So that is very much the science of nutrition as we
Mhm.
know it today, in which we eat things and it has certain types of fat, certain percentages of fat, certain vitamins, and how those nutrients come in and affect us directly. And people are pretty much familiar with that. That's the emphasis of a lot of healthy diets and healthful
Right.
approaches. But what a lot of them don't consider is the other direct effect, which is sort of the other side of the coin, if you will. And that is looking at how processed and ultra processed foods with different additives, the way they're produced, the way that they're grown, introduce things that have a negative effect directly upon us.
Hmm.
And then, so that's a series of both positive and negative direct effects. Now we have, and this is where it gets interesting, this is where it gets fun, is that there's a whole world of indirect effects. So we have this thing that really we've known about for a long time. And I'll give away my age. Back when I was in medical school, when we were still using leeches, and bleeding people in the old fashioned way, I was told that, oh, well, there's bacteria that live in our gut. Don't pay any attention to them. They just eat the indigestible bits of fiber and things that we can't digest.
Okay.
Really, in the last 10 years, and primarily in the last 5 years, and I write about this extensively in the new book, The Food Shaman, we learned that this gut microbiome is incredibly powerful. So what we eat indirectly affects us by directly affecting these bacteria. And there are about 100 trillion bacteria, primarily that live in our gut. Now, when we consider that the human organism has only about 10 trillion human cells, and what comprises us 100 trillion bacteria cells, if we step back and just think of that enormity, 90% of the cells that make up you and I are not ours. They're not even human. And
Mm.
to give you an idea how many that is, if you can look out now, I have the advantage of living in Montana, where I can walk out and see a beautiful starry night. And I'm sure somewhere in the wonderful country of Canada, you can walk out and see
Yes.
big open spaces. If you look up into the sky, there are more bacteria that live in your gut than stars you can
Them
see.
stars. Eek.
That's impressive. Now, individually, they're very small. Together, they have a huge, huge impact on our health. So, in short, what we choose, or at least what we think we consciously choose to eat, affects the composition and quality of these bacteria. It turns out that far from being kind of the separate thing that eats the leftover bits we can't digest, they are in constant communication with our gut, with
Mhm.
our brain, with our immune system, with our neurological system, with our cardiovascular system, and so in this constant give and fro, take and receive of information. These bacteria have even been shown, believe it or not, to be able to turn some human genes on in our cells and turn them off. They're so powerful that they are really more like an organ, another
Mhm.
type of organ that works with us. And, I like to say that because I'm a simple guy. I got to keep it simple. If I look at, how do we develop disease? How does one person eating one thing in a household get terribly ill, and why does another person not? When we look at it from that more Eastern perspective, a more holistic perspective, what it comes down to is really two things: our genetics that we're born with, and right now we can't really do a lot to change that, and the environment. And in my opinion, there is no bigger environmental component to that equation than the environment we take from the outside and put inside our bodies every single day.
Mm.
And that's the food we eat.
Yeah.
And the razor thin interface between that environment and its effects on us are all those bacteria in our gut. So that's very, very powerful. And what we are also learning, much to the amazement of individuals everywhere, is that how we feel, if we're feeling depressed, if we're feeling angry, if we're under stress. Now, I just got back from spending several weeks in the UK doing some research for an upcoming book. And just the fact that I travel time zones will negatively affect the gut bacteria because it's a bodily stress. All those stresses impact our gut bacteria. They impact us, and around it goes. But it's linked and interconnected in such a profound and dramatic way, but also in a way that when we think about it, really is an example of how we are connected, to the universe and to nature at
Mm.
large. So
And
it's a wonderful question.
we hear a lot mindful eating. So I'm going to give you two scenarios, and you tell me if one affected the health more than the other.
Okay.
Okay, so
I
I
love pop quizzes.
yeah.
You at home, you don't have to take the quiz, but play along with me.
So in one scenario, so it's the way I grew up. So each meal we were sitting at the table, we were having meal as a family, we were discussing. There was no TV on, no radio, no technology. It was just time to share what you did in your day and how you're feeling, and if there's any concern, and stuff like that. And on the other hand is the way, sorry, but it's the way my husband grew up. Is individually eating, and it's I'm not judging because it's due to certain circumstances, but is sitting in front of the TV eating quickly, and then always need to have some noise around. So can one or the other affect health more?
That's a great question. And the answer, in case you were playing along at home, is C, both. So, and I talk about this in the book because there's really some great emerging scientific uh, information in terms of looking at inflammatory markers and so forth. So let's take scenario A, the way that you grew up, and what I would agree with is I would term it, and I talk about this a lot, and when we talk about sort of quantum food, and what does that mean? Well, it means not just looking at the nutrients, but looking at with whom and how we eat, as you're pointing out. And what we see is that has a tremendous impact on our food. And let me give you just a quick example with some scientific basis in this one. So we talk about, very often being mindful of our food
Mhm.
and approaching our meal by taking a step back. And I like to do this, and I encourage people, it's about gratitude.
Yeah.
And whether it's simply, I've done martial arts for many years, and I remember being in Japan, and we went out for sushi after training one night, and our soke, our grandmaster, stopped us before any of us ate and said, you need to stop and give thanks to this fish because it gave its life for you.
Hmm.
That was a tremendously noble thing for that fish to do, and you need to stop and appreciate that. And whether you do that, whether you say a blessing of thanks to the Lord, whatever means it is, when we shift into that moment of gratitude, we change our neurological functioning at the moment. And we move from a traditional dopamine based receptor, which is our reward, pleasure, etc., which is how a lot of people process food because they're eating on the run. They're taking in sugar.
Mhm.
Sugar releases that dopamine receptor, and they get a pleasure response. people are very familiar with that reward pleasure
Right.
mechanism. But we shift into actually oxytocin release. And an oxytocin based pathway is one that's based on the mother's love of a child. The more love you get, to quote the Beatles, the more love you give, the more love you get.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is not subject to habituation. That is not subject to requiring more sugar to get that same feeling.
Right.
The more you do it, the more it grows. And that shows in those benefits. So we have one scenario, the one you engage in, which is based on a certain neurological state of being that has positive uh, effects in terms of our gut microbiome as well, compared to one that is not neutral. So as I saw people, having to hand check their Cinnabons because they were about the size of a carry-on suitcase, at the airport, and just mindlessly eating, that sugar because it's a fix, neither enjoying it or being even aware, I think, of
Mm-hmm.
the consumption, what we find is that has a tremendously negative effect on the body. One of the things that I wrote about in the book is that when we look at ourselves and our gut microbiome as living systems, there really is no neutral. We're either in evolution moving forward or in dissolution moving back into disability and disease. So we want to try to focus on those things, which you highlighted and which I discuss in detail in the book, that we know and are been increasingly shown to be incredibly powerful in terms of outcome. And I'm going to jump in with one more brief thing because
Yeah.
I think that this is very powerful. When people engage in those types of activities that you said your husband does, so we eat alone, we're on the dopamine receptor pathway, we're depressed, we're stressed. Depression has proven to be as powerful risk factor for the development of cardiovascular disease and future cardiovascular events as any cholesterol level. So doctors everywhere, we care and we check about your cholesterol and we give you a pill. But that depression is just as potent a risk factor. And that
Mm-hmm.
has to do a lot when we look at things like the food experience, which is what you're talking about. And a recent study was just published, I think in the last week or two, that showed that people that have healthful relationships, so they're married, etc., they have 43% less risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, 55% less risk of dying from a stroke compared to people who are unmarried, who are depressed, who are lonely, who are widowed. These people that sit in front of a TV and
Mm-hmm.
gobble their food mindlessly. These are powerful numbers and powerful statistics.
Wow.
And just because we can't currently explain them very well with the science we have does not mean that they're not valid. And we
Mm-hmm.
have a habit in the scientific community, in the medical community, particularly the Western medical community, which I will own up for, because I'm a big believer that what happens is we can't explain it, so we tend to throw it away.
Yeah.
And it becomes what I call neutral logic, where if a study says, oh, well, we looked at this, but it's not a very good study, but it did show that saturated fat is bad, we say, oh, yes, we're right, saturated fat is bad. When we look at these tremendous amounts of evidence that show there's no effect of saturated fat on
Mm-hmm.
heart disease, cancer, or mortality, we say, well, we can't really explain that very well. It doesn't agree with our current model. We're going to ignore that as an outlier, or you hear it all the time. It's a paradox. The
Mm-hmm.
Mediterranean paradox, the French paradox, the Inuit paradox. And I say instead, we need to start paying attention to that evidence.
Yes. And that leads me to my next question, because we hear, as you said, we hear often, oh, don't eat this because it will lead to this. And then a month later, oh, it's the opposite. And I remember a few years ago, it was tomatoes. If you eat tomato, you're going to have cancer. So yeah. I remember because my sister, she became all hysterical about it. She was like, "No, don't eat tomatoes." And she's really gullible. I love my sister. So
Well,
so
I think it's not a matter of being gullible. I think it's hard for folks, and
mm,
I think your sister is just like so many of us. I mean, I do this full time. I
yeah.
love it with a passion, And I will tell you, it is hard for me to keep up with the data, and it changes every day, doesn't it? It's tomatoes. It's don't have coffee, you're going to get prostate cancer. It's like, oh, have 4 cups of coffee, you're going to become an immortal.
Right.
Don't eat eggs because they have all these things. Oh, eat eggs because they're really good for you. Don't eat red meat. Red meat's okay. Avoid processed meat. So it's this ever shifting sands. But I think one of the interesting things is I've not only looked at a lot of contemporary diets to kind of tease out what are the bits. Is there a superfood? Is there an approach that seems to be best? But in one of my books, I covered a book called Ancient Eats. I looked at historical diets because we've really only seen the incidence and prevalence of these, what I call diseases and disabilities of modern civilization: diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancers, particularly gastrointestinal cancers, etc., since sort of post-World War II, when we really changed things. So you and I, as human beings, our physiology really hasn't changed for several 100,000, if not several million years, once we started using cooked foods. And likewise, since we started ingesting cooked foods, we developed, or I should say, gut bacteria co-evolved to co-metabolize those types of foods with us. And those types of food, particularly meats, red meats, maritime foods, so fish that your mom said was a brain food, shellfish, etc. These types of foods not only helped us evolve as a species, but gave us the brain power to dominate the planet. Now, if our physiology hasn't changed and our gut bacteria hasn't changed, what has changed in the last 50 to 75 years or so that all of a sudden these things that we ate for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, that gave us positive benefit and made us evolve positively, all of a sudden are taboo? Well, if it's not you and I, and it's not the gut bacteria, it's the food. And so we need to go back and not say red meat is bad. We need to understand that when we take a heritage breed and we let it do what cows normally do, which is eat grass in a field and graze on big expanses, the steak that we get is nowhere near the same food item that one gets when they're fed GMO corn.
Right.
They live in a cubicle for their entire life, and they're raised in this concentrated animal feeding operation, and they're fed antibiotics and so on and so forth. Yet when you look at the data, what is it people do? They say, well, don't eat red meat. But what every chef has known, and here's where I want to give credit, not to people in healthcare, but to people in the culinary world, my culinary peers, because about, the last 10 to 20 years, a decade or two ago, chefs got back to getting to food that was organically grown, real food, farm to table, clean eating, whatever you want to call it. And they served it on a plate because they didn't want to order from the big conglomerates, and they charged people more.
Okay.
Not because it was more healthy for us, but because it tasted better. And lo and behold, we are now starting to see a separation of data and health endpoints when one pursues the modern Western diet or standard American diet, whatever you want to call it, versus the pursuit and eating of real foods. And so now healthcare is kind of catching up, but chefs pursued it because it simply tasted good. So when we pursue that pathway, we get scrumptious and salubrious. We get food that, from a culinary perspective, as a chef, as a foodie, it's what you and I want to eat. It's real food. It has real flavor. It's got tasters. It's got, taste. It's got great flavor. It's visually pleasing. Those are the sorts of things we love to eat because it tastes good. Lo and behold, the beauty of that, Vicki, is that turns out to be good for us. And it can be red meat. It can be eggs. It's fat. It's saturated fat. It's not about eat this, don't eat that. It's not about a miracle diet or a superfood. It's about real food. It's about authentic food. I'm not here to sell people some, gimmick on this. Supplements are great if folks need them, but avoid the snake oil. Get with real food. Simply source your food like a chef. Your palate's going to thank you. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
And what's going to turn out, it's your body's really going to thank you as well.
Yes. So there's no best diet, or there's no best way.
So I would say both. And folks, I really am all over here and there. So I'm going to answer you once again, yes and no. So I think no, if we're looking for, this is a miracle diet. This is a
Mm,
superfood. Take this supplement and then you can go through the drive-through. Supplements are great for helping to jumpstart healthful eating. If you travel, as I said, I was traveling, so I take probiotics with me when I travel,
mm,
as long as you get a good brand, etc. So they can be beneficial as part of a diet, but they're supplements. So you can't supplement your way to good health.
right.
Don't buy into anybody that's telling you eat this, don't eat that. As I said, if we look at the history of foods, what we find is all of these foods in their natural states are wonderful for
Mm,
us, particularly when we look at different populations that don't eat the modern Western or standard American diet. What I found in my research that there wasn't a best diet. The Mediterranean had advantages. The Inuit diet, so if you take the Mediterranean, you say, well, we need to eat more fruits and vegetables and have more olive oil. I point to the Inuit diet where all they eat is fat and blubber and,
mm,
fermented seal liver, because you can't grow green vegetables, in the Arctic, right? It's winter.
right.
Um, they had cardiovascular rates 54% of that's what's shown in the United States. You look at the Okinawan diet or the Japanese diet, it's nothing like the ingredients in the Mediterranean diet,
Mm,
yet it's more healthful, and so on and so on and so on. But what there is a universality in approach. Every single one of these, modern or ancient, on any part of the planet, it's simply what we talked about. It's about real food. There's a de-emphasis on convenience culture, a de-emphasis on ultra processed and highly processed, ready to eat fixins, and a focus on getting it fresh, getting organic, making it real, fresh seafood, heritage breeds of beef and pork, organic eggs, fresh poultry, real fresh fruits and vegetables that aren't grown or exposed to pesticides. Where we ever thought spraying our vegetables with poison before we brought them
mm,
to our plate was like a really good idea. I'm not really sure where that came to be,
right.
but paying attention to those details, being a chef and sourcing your ingredients, that is the best diet. So I'd say in that sense, there's a best approach, but it's about an attitude. And it's about not just sourcing the best ingredients, but what you talked about. It's about sharing recipes,
Mhm,
about sharing meals. It's about having that fellowship with our food, in a very productive, relaxed, and human endeavor. So I think it's a best diet is really a best attitude. It's a
mm.
best approach. And whatever you like on your personal palate, whatever you foods, there's a way to get from here to there that's going to make you happy. And that's really what one of the big studies out of Harvard showed, was called the Harvard Happiness Study. They followed people for 75 years. And they looked and said, was it the food they ate? Was it their socioeconomic status? Was it their educational level? And what was amazing was for people to be healthy and happy into their elder years, it was about relationships. And I'm sorry, Facebook folks with 4,000 friends, it's not about the quantity of relationships.
Mm, the
It was
quality.
about the quality. And that is what makes the difference. So I'm reaching out to all of you as much as we can here, in video land, to have some sort of relationship here and convey this information that it's about the relationship, and that is the food experience.
But I'm gonna be the devil's advocate here
Great.
because because if someone suffers from a specific health condition, there are some food that they can integrate into their diet that will help the symptoms, right? It's not necessarily a, the best diet, but there are some. I'm thinking about some fat, for example, good fat to feed the brain well,
Mhm.
right? So a lot of professional out there, they recommend maybe ketogenic diet for someone, suffering from Alzheimer, for example. So do you agree with that, or do you think it's just the whole?
I think there's evidence, but again, when we look at a lot of these approaches, so you can take paleo, you could
Mhm,
take ketogenic, you could take Atkins. What we find in a lot of those approaches is what that the emphasis is on decreasing carbohydrate loads,
Right.
and particularly refined and processed and ultra processed carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
That's the mainstay of the modern Western diet. So is the benefit coming from these foods that they say are beneficial, or is it from the removal of
Mm.
these constituents of the modern Western diet, which is what I'm saying? And the answer is it may be one, it may be other, maybe a combination of both. One of my good friends, Sean Wells, and I encourage folks to follow up with him, is one of the world's experts in the ketogenic diet. And he and I have had, many discussions, because what's very interesting is the ketogenic approach to eating is very likely not very far removed from our ancient diets,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with periods of fasting, whether it be 18 hours overnight or longer bits of fasting and so forth. So I think that the commonality, instead of looking for a miracle, because you'll say here, ketogenic diet, reduction in likelihood of Alzheimer's disease, but there's also the mind diet, which encourages the consumption of carbohydrates, particularly berries, which are rich in certain health um, constituents
Mm-hmm.
that also show a reduction. So do I have to avoid berries if I'm on the ketogenic diet? Probably, because you have to cut them way down. Should I? My response is, if you need to find some sort of diet to lose weight, that's a separate question. And what research shows is, in the short term, nothing really makes a difference. It's
Mm.
just if you stick with it. But then what do we do? What do we follow for our lifetime that can give us pleasure? All these diets that you're referring to, for me, as a foodie, as a chef, they're all about restricting me from eating things.
Right.
Can't have this, don't have that, don't have berries. I don't like that. I'm a foodie. I want to experience the world of food.
Right.
And what I'm saying is that you can. So, for instance, you've heard, don't eat fat saturated fats because they'll make you fat and then you'll get diabetes and you'll die.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we look at dairy fats, I talk about this again in the book, what we find is, if you actually eat whole fat fermented foods that are dairy, so full fat yogurts and full fat cheeses, which are loaded with saturated fat and cholesterol, you reduce your risk of developing diabetes by about 60. That's a 60%. I can tell you firsthand, and this is what kind of things we'll talk about on the show, reverse, that big pharmaceutical is not interested in you reducing your chances of developing diabetes by 60%.
Mm.
They are very happy in screening you to get a new customer
Right.
to take their medicine.
Right.
Excuse me. But you see a big emphasis on low fat, no fat, etc. dairy. There is not one iota of evidence anywhere that suggests that is better. Yet, because of good marketing, so many people will choose
Mm.
that. What is that? That is pasteurized, ultra processed, and processed foods. So I think in the short term, if you need to lose weight, different discussion. In the long term, for maintenance, if you really look towards whole natural foods, you're going to be able to find, I think, a diet that tantalizes your palate, that
Mm-hmm.
makes us happy. Because again, you and I talked about attitude, which counts for a lot.
Right.
And if I restrict you from eating foods that you love, I make you miserable. So in a certain way, I'm short circuiting the very path I need to get you on, which is to be a happy person. And
Mm.
isn't that what we all want with life? We just
Right.
talked about it. It's about being happy. And for me, that food experience, with the foods we eat, the meals we share, that food experience is so important in our lives. Because if you ask anyone about their 5 top or 10 experiences, several of them will surround some food event.
Some
It's
food. Yeah.
hardwired in our DNA, and we need to turn that from this dry, clinical, scientific endeavor back into a human endeavor. As I like to say, one of the interesting things about quantum mechanics, and I'm not going to make anybody do any math, I promise, but what it exposed to us is that classical physics failed because classical physics promised us an abstract universe that ran by logic
Mm.
and logic alone. And you could take human beings out of it, and the universe would run like some big machine. And there's a great book by Carlos Rovelli where he talks about this in terms even I can understand. So if I can get it, everyone can get it. But basically, what he said was that was a lie. And what quantum mechanics has shown, perhaps the biggest take-home lesson, is that you can't have an observer, and you can't have a universe without an observer. It's
Mm,
integrated. We are all interconnected. And so my culinary is you can't have dinner without the diner.
right,
We've got to be part of this process.
right.
It's not about sort of this clinical abstraction. That's a lie. That's disconnected. That will never work. And that's what all the evidence now from looking at these things from 50 years ago, the last half century, has been showing us we've been
Mm.
wrong.
All right. We are almost to the end of the interview, unfortunately, but
Oh,
I know,
go for it.
I could continue that conversation for hours, but there's one thing I want to ask you because it's a hot subject.
Okay.
What is your take on calorie counting? Because all of my friends are counting their calorie, and I don't count my calorie, and they're like, "What are you doing? You have to count your calorie." But anyway, so I want to hear from you. What do you think?
So, Vicky, you're a genius, and people should listen to you.
Okay,
That's number one.
thank you, thank you.
Number two, if folks want to know more about this, one of my previous books is called The Fallacy of the Calorie: Why the Modern Western Diet is Killing Us and How to Stop It. So there's a whole book devoted to this because it is so important and really, again, highlights the misdirection we've followed for the last half century. So let me summarize that real quick in a couple of key points. One, the take home is disregard calories. They have nothing to do with health. They have nothing to do with how your body metabolizes food. They have nothing to do with food value. So calories came about in the early part of the Industrial Revolution when people were looking at fuel for, hold on, here it comes, steam engines. Had nothing to do with people because it was the Industrial Revolution. And they said, wow, if I burn a pound of coal, it has more calories. What does that mean? It means that I burn a pound of coal versus a pound of wood. I get a more efficient machine. I get a more
Mm.
efficient steam engine. Now, there was a guy who was studying in Germany at the time, an American called Wilbur Atwell, and we actually still use his guide because at the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of work was still being done by humans and farm animals. And he said, hey, if we can feed people and animals foods that are high in calories and have them do work, they'll be more efficient machines. And
Mm.
everybody at that time understood that. In the ensuing decades and centuries since that was passed in the 1860s, so we're now talking about a system that's like 150 years old of evaluating food value, we've kind of lost that, and caloric value now has become conflated with food value.
It's like the
How
broken telephone.
Yeah, and a broken clock, well,
Yeah.
no, a broken clock is right twice a day. This is
Yeah.
never right because how you get calories is you put a food in a bomb calorimeter and you incinerate it to ashes. And then
Mm.
you measure how much heat was given off to raise the water temperature. A calorie is how much heat is required, 1 calorie, to raise 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius at 1 atmosphere pressure. Nothing to do with food value.
Right.
And it has to be burned and incinerated. And now we don't even burn that food. We just use a rough estimate and say it's 9 kcals for fat, 4 for carbs, 4 for proteins, 7 for alcohol. And then we roughly approximate calories.
Right.
So one, nobody, unless you are the devil himself, metabolizes food by incinerating into ash.
Mm.
Two, it speaks to nothing of the nutritive value in terms of healthy fats, unhealthy fats, vitamins, minerals, etc. And we disregard the very important non-digestible carbohydrates that feed our gut microbiome and keep us healthy. They are excluded when you count calories. So really, what we need is we need to look at quality of food, not categories of food, and that includes calories.
Mm. All right. So don't count your calories.
Enjoy your food. What
Thank
you
you.
need to do is ask 3 questions. This is what I want to leave folks with if they've heard nothing else from my meanderings today. Here's the 3 take-home points to source like a chef and focus on the quality of food. Whenever you're going to eat something in a restaurant, whenever you're buying it, ask yourself 3 simple questions. How was it bred? So is it heritage breed? Is it farmed? Is it raised organically? Is it wild caught? Is it conventional? Is it caged? So on and so forth. So how is it bred? Then what was it fed? Was it raised organically? Is it a GMO plant product, sprayed with lots of pesticides, and the plant itself manipulated, to process those, so on and so forth. And then where was it led? Was it, highly processed? Was it ultra processed before it got to you? You're basically asking from when they harvested this food to when it's coming to my plate, what transpired. And those are my chef secrets to getting quality food items and ingredients.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. Before I
Thank you,
let you
Vicki.
go, you're welcome. Before I let you go, you do have a gift that you would like to offer to the audience today.
Oh, absolutely. So folks, head over to my website, which is www.chef.dr.mike, Chef Dr. Mike. We'll be putting up just a link, and you can get a collection of monographs that go into a little bit more detail on some things like health benefits of turmeric, our current understanding of Roundup and GMOs. So they're kind of companion-free PDF monographs to the new book, which is Food Shaman, The Art of Quantum Food. Folks can get that on Amazon while they're there. And while they're there, if they sign up for the newsletter, they'll get some previews and recipes before our weekly show each week. So I encourage folks to do that. I want to thank you. I want to thank all the folks that took time from their busy schedules to join me and listen to what I had to say today. So I'm always humbled. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much. And again, thank you everybody at home for watching. The link is in the email you receive with the video. So just click on the link and enjoy. And Chef Dr. Mike, one last word.
Keep cooking. Keep cooking real food. Keep cooking. So keep cooking real food.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.